I want to teach you Webflow 101 as fast as I possibly can so that you can get your website off the ground and get your project up and running. All right. I will have a Webflow link down in the description below if you want to sign up, but let's stop talking. We've only got a few minutes here. Here we go. All right. So let's come to exhibit 1 here. And we're going to start off by talking about the building blocks of Webflow. How do we build the structure or the foundation of our Webflow website? Okay. Now, before we even dive in here, I want to talk high level about how we build websites in general. Essentially, website building, if you've never done it before, is just like Legos, okay? You get different types of elements or different types of Lego blocks, and you can stack them and nest them and group them together however you need to structure your Lego build or your website correctly, okay? So that's what we're doing. We're just using blocks in blocks and with other blocks to build our sites, okay? So what am I talking about? Well, the first type of block we have, first type of Lego block we have is something called a section, okay? And a section is essentially just a way we can segment or break apart our web page into different groups or different sections, okay? So it's kind of the highest level of our hierarchy here, or our most general building block that we can use. It's called a section. Now, inside our section here, we have a container, okay? And a container is kind of like a section, but it just gives us a little bit of margin out to the left and the right of our web page so that when we have content inside of our website, it doesn't spill all the way over to the edge of your computer screen. Okay, so that's a container. And then inside our container here, we have 2 what we call div blocks. And div blocks are going to be your most flexible, your most used Lego block that you use when you're building your Webflow websites, okay? And they're called div blocks. Now, what we can do with div blocks is kind of endless. We can have 2 div blocks next to each other, and we can put different text inside each of these div blocks if we want. All right, so we can do text there, and we can drop in an image here maybe. And so you can start to see how we can kind of separate out the elements on our web page by grouping them inside or nesting them inside different div blocks. Okay, you can also put div blocks inside of div blocks to give you some really cool functionality and customization in some more complex Webflow builds. So for example, I can drop a div block right here into my other div block. Okay, so you can see here I just dropped in a new div, it's white, and then I can even copy that div and make a second div. All right. And then I could put more divs inside of that, et cetera, et cetera. So essentially what we're doing with these div blocks is build the foundation or the structure of our websites. Okay, let's scroll down now to exhibit 2 where we can talk about an alternative to using div blocks. Okay, so if we don't want to use div blocks and we want more of a rigid structure, kind of a pre-built rigid structure, we can use something called a grid. Okay, and so instead of dropping in 4 different div blocks here and formatting each of them, I can just drop in one what we call grid. Okay, inside of Webflow, we can drop in a grid. And what's cool about this is, like I said, instead of having to drop in 4 separate divs, we can just drop in a grid, and then we can come over here and add in as many different columns and rows as we need, okay, for our website. All right, so that's a grid. So if you don't want to use divs, you can use grids. Okay, so now that we have kind of our base building blocks here inside of Webflow, we have sections, containers, divs, and grids. How do we use those and customize them to get the different elements in the right position on our web page? Okay, it's great to have Lego blocks right there just in front of you building stuff, but how do we tweak them and how do we move them around to build something really cool? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next here in exhibit 3. All right, so let's talk about layout here. All right, and so here we go. In exhibit 3, we have a section and a container, and then we have 2 div blocks inside of this container. Okay, so these 2 div blocks are nested inside this container. Now, right now I have div block 1 stacked on top of div block 2. And inside each div block, I have some fake header text and some fake paragraph text stacked on top of each other. Now, what if I want to, instead of having div block 1 on top of div block 2, I want div block 1 to the left of div block 2. How could I do that? Well, it's very, very simple inside of Webflow. What we're going to do is we're going to use something called Flexbox. Okay. Now, Flexbox, when you first start off in Webflow, is the steepest learning curve, I think. But once you master Flexbox, you master Webflow, in my opinion. Okay, so let me show you what I'm talking about here. So with my container element selected, okay, my container in this case is going to be what we call the parent element. All right, and so my container is the parent element, and inside my parent, I have 2 children elements, okay, which are both of these divs. So with my parent container element selected, I'm going to come over to the right here. I'm going to come down to layout, and I'm going to switch from block to flex, okay? And what that does is essentially enable Flexbox on this parent container element. And once we do that, once we enable Flexbox on the parent, we can then tell the children what to do with just a few clicks. Okay, and this is the power of Webflow. So I could, with these direction arrows, keep them stacked like this, or I could have them go left to right like this. I could also align these differently once I get them left to right or up and down. In this case, I have them left to right, and I could align these to the top, to the center, to the bottom, or I could stretch them the entire height of my container. All right, so there's a lot of functionality here. Now, the next thing I can do is I can come to div block 1 here, and I can actually control the position of the child element as well once the parent is flexed. And so I can come to align, and I can just on div 1 control where this div is laying inside of my container by using these align buttons, okay? And I can do the same thing here with div block 2, where I can kind of offset these and do cool things like this. And this is all with Flexbox, all right? So you can control the children elements as well once the parent is flexed. Now, here's what's really cool about Webflow is now, even though the div is a child to the container, the div can serve as a parent to the header text and the paragraph text. And so what I can do is if I select this div block 1 and I flex this, well, now I have control of where my header text is and my paragraph text. And so now I can do cool stuff like this. So I can either stack it like this, I could move it left, I could move it right, I could move it to the bottom center, or I could stack it left to right like this and control it this way. All right, so those are the Flexbox basics. There's a lot more you can get into with Flexbox here. And again, it gets very complex. I have a tutorial I will have linked up above right now that can help you walk through the Webflow Flexbox tutorial. I think it's the #1 place you should start when you're learning Webflow for the first time. All right, so remember, if we master Flexbox, we master Webflow, but it's gonna take a little bit of time. Okay? If you guys are new to Webflow and you're looking for a new website building home and you like the way that this video looks, you like the way that Webflow feels, well, go down in the description below. I'll have a link out to Webflow down there that you can use to sign up to begin your Webflow journey. All right, let's get back to the video. Okay, let's move down to Exhibit 4 and talk a little bit more about some more advanced positioning techniques that we can do. All right, and so we talked about Flexbox. Now we're going to talk about positioning. All right, and so let's say, for example, inside my container here, I have 3 elements. I have div block 1, I have a text block that says container, and I have div block 2. All right, now I want to move this text block out from like in between these 2 divs. I want to fix this text box up to the top left of my container, all right? Just like I have section locked up here to the top left of the section, I want container locked to the top left of my container. How can I do that? Well, we can use something called positioning to kind of open up even more possibilities than Flexbox gives us. And so what we can do is, if I grab our container or I grab our parent element and I come over to the right and I scroll down to position and I switch that from static to relative, and all that's doing is essentially enabling this more advanced positioning on this container, on this parent element. And then I come here to my text block and I switch this from static to absolute. What that does now is it absolutely positions that text box wherever I decide to put it inside of my relatively positioned parent element. And so I can move this text block all over my relative parent here, all right? And what's really cool about that is this text block is now almost above the div blocks. So the div blocks can now be evenly spaced and centered inside of my container, while this text block can live almost above it wherever I want to put it, okay? And that's called being absolutely positioned, all right? So that's really cool. Now I can do the same thing here, where if I want to move div block 1 text or div block 2 text up to these corners, well, what I can do is I can grab the parent div of that text, I can switch it to relative, and then I can grab my text block and switch that position to absolute. Again, that now gives me absolute position functionality inside its relatively positioned parent, okay? So I can move it to any of the corners here instead of div block 1. Same thing here, if I go to div block 2 and I position this as relative, and then I grab my header text here and I position that as absolute, well, I can do the exact same thing here, okay? So I can have this one at bottom left, this one top left if I wanted to, okay? So you get a lot of customization there. So that's called absolute positioning. One other one I will show you here real quick before we move on to Exhibit 5 is I want to show you something called fixed positioning. Okay, so if I come up here to our Webflow 101 speed tutorial, or kind of like our title here, our title element at the top of our page, well, you can see when I scroll, it just kind of, it lives at the top of the page. So when I scroll, it disappears. But what if I want, like as a nav bar, what if I just want it fixed or locked up at the top of my page? And so what I can do is if I grab this text block here and I come to position and I position it fixed, well, you can see now that when I scroll, it just stays there. So it's fixed at the top of my screen. And so that's another way that you can position elements inside of Webflow if you need to. And the last thing I want to show you here is one last way that we can affect the positioning or the way our Lego blocks are laid out on the page, okay? And this is more like fine tuning. So if you've used Flexbox and you've used positioning techniques and you still want to fine tune where your elements are on the page, then we can turn to adding margin or padding. And so for example, let's say I want div block 1 and div block 2 to have a little bit more of a gap in between them. So I'm just going to grab div block 1 and I'm going to come over here to spacing, and right here on the right side of my margin, I'm just going to add some margin here. So I'm going to add 40 pixels of margin in between div block 1 and div block 2 out to the right. Okay, so that increases our gap a little bit. Now, another thing I can do is, for example, let's say I want my paragraph text in div block 2 to be a little bit further away from my header text. Well, it's simple. All I have to do is grab my paragraph and just add a little bit more margin to the top, okay? And so that'll give it a little bit more of a gap. So you really want to use margin and padding as sparingly as possible. You want to rely mostly on Flexbox and other positioning techniques that we've just talked about. But when you really want to fine tune where something lives on your page, margin and padding is kind of your last case scenario, okay, to really fine tune it. So now that we've talked about the building blocks of Webflow with our sections, containers, divs, and grids, and we kind of know how we can position them relative to each other inside of Webflow by using Flexbox or absolute positioning or fixed positioning or margin and padding, how do we make these elements look pretty? How can we make our websites beautiful? Well, to do that, let's come down to Exhibit 5 and I'll show you what we can do. So again, we have a section and a container. I have two div blocks here, but there's no style applied to any of them, okay? And I have header text and paragraph text. Well, what I can do here is, firstly, I will give each of these divs a different colored background so we can see them against the container, right? So to do that, I'm gonna grab a div, and you come down to backgrounds here. We're just gonna give it a new color, okay? We can give it any color we want. And I'll probably go like this light purple here. All right, and then, so I'll leave that one there, and then I'll come to my second div here, and I'm gonna give this one a gradient background, okay? So I'm gonna make this one look really cool. So I choose gradient, and I can kind of change the angle of my gradient here, all right? And I can change the colors of each end of this gradient, so maybe red on that end, and if I grab over here on this slider, I can change this to maybe a darker red, so we get a nice little gradient there, all right? And so that looks kind of cool. Okay, the next thing I want to do is I want to make my text look a little better. So I'm going to come and I'm going to grab my style header and I'm going to change the weight of that font. So I'm going to make it extra bold. I'm going to increase the size a little bit. Okay, that looks good. And then I'm going to come to my paragraph text here. I'm going to make this italicized and I'm going to change the color of it. So I want to make it white. All right, so that looks kind of cool. All right, so then I'm going to come to paragraph 2 and I'm going to change the font. All right, so let's change it to Inconsolata. That's how you say it. I don't know. And then I'm going to come down here to more type options. And I want to make every letter capitalized. And I can change the direction here and do some crazy stuff. But that looks pretty good. Now, what I want to do is, on each of these divs, I want to give them a border. Okay, and so to do that, I'm going to grab the div right here. And I'm going to come down to the border section. Okay, and I want to give a border to all 4 sides of my div. So I'm just going to add a line here. And I'm going to make it, I don't know, I'm going to make my line blue. And then I'm going to make it pretty thick, so you can kind of see what that looks like. Okay, so I've given my div here a box or a border. I'm going to do the same thing over here, just so you can see it again. And this one's going to be 4 pixels thick, and it's going to be black. Okay, so I'm giving borders to my divs. And then another thing I can do is I can grab my divs, and I can curve their corners. So I can give it a radius, we call it. So I come to radius here and I add, I don't know, 5 pixels of radius. You can see now that my corners of div block 1 are curved. In div block 2, I can do the same thing. I can curve it even more. put 20 pixels. Now, the next thing I'll show you is I'll grab my div block 1 again, and I want to give it a little bit of a box shadow. I want to give it a little bit of shadow in the background, make it look kind of cool. All right, and so what I can do is I can come down to Effects, Box Shadow, and I'm going to give shadow to the outside of my div. And so I'll give it a little X, I'll give it a little Y shadow. I'll blur it so it looks a little softer. I can make its size a little bigger so you can see I'm impacting the shadow over there. All right, and then I can change the color of that shadow. So I can make it a little lighter or a little darker, whatever I want to do. But that looks pretty good. All right, cool. So hopefully now you get a sense of the different things that you can do inside of Webflow to make your website pretty. Now, this right now looks ugly. I have like this purple box, and then I have this really ugly red box. That's not going to work for me. I want a standardized style across my website. So I want all my div blocks to look the same. I want all my text to look the same and be the same color and be the same size. And to do that, we're going to use something called classes, okay? And classes are a way that we can standardize the style of our Webflow site very quickly. So instead of having to style this div block and this div block the same 2 different times, I can just apply a class to each of those divs, and it does it for us automatically. So watch this. This div block right here has a class over here called style div 1, okay? So this is the name of the class that I give it, okay? And that's just the tag that I've given that div. You can see my paragraph text has a class as well. It's called style paragraph 1. You can see my header text also has a class, and it's called style header 1, okay? So all of these classes are what's giving and attaching these different styles to each element on the page. So if I want to standardize this div on the left to my div on the right, all I have to do is take my style div 1 class on div block 1 and apply it to div block 2. So if I delete this class, you can see all my style goes away. And if I change it to style div 1, now both of my divs look exactly the same. Okay, so they have the same curved radius, they have that box shadow, same background color, etc. Same thing here. If I want my header text to look exactly like this style header 1 class, well, it's quite simple. I just delete this and I just add that class, style header 1. Perfect. And then last but not least, I can do the same thing here and give it a class of style paragraph 1. Boom. And so now with our classes, we have now styled our divs and our text consistently across the website, okay? And so the next time I want to add a div, for example, I can just copy this and paste it, and that style and that class will carry through. And now the cool thing is, if I ever change the color of this text here, they will all change in tandem together. Okay, so you can see I'm changing them all in tandem together. And that's because each of these paragraphs has the same class attached to it. Okay, so that's classes. Okay, let's move down to Exhibit 6 here now, and I want to show you some basic animations, okay? So animations are really, really cool. Webflow, I think, is the best at allowing users to build in these animations without knowing how to use JSON or code or anything like that, okay? So it's very simple to get a Webflow interaction, they call it, up and running live on your site. All you have to do is you have to select the element that you want animated. So in this case, I want my left div here, my style div 1, to kind of move up when I scroll down the page. I want it to move a little bit. Okay, I want it to animate. And so all you have to do is you have to choose the element that you want to animate. All right, and so in this case, I want my left div block here, my style div 1, to animate when I scroll down the page. So I'm going to choose that. I'm going to come over here to interactions, and I'm going to choose element trigger. So I'm going to add an element trigger, and I'm going to say scroll into view. Okay, so my trigger is when this element scrolls into view on my web page, something's going to happen. All right, and so what I want to happen here is I want it to, I don't know, let's say slide. And I want it to slide from the bottom up. Okay, so I want it to slide up into the page when I scroll down the page. All right, and then I'm going to give it just a slight offset here, maybe 10%. And so then you can see that when I preview my page, I'll scroll up here. When I preview my page and I scroll down, you can see that element just slid up. Okay, and so I'll do it again for you. You can see that when I scroll in, that div block moves up, and just that div block. Okay, so that's really cool. And so what I can do is, if you found it hard to see, well, I can come back into my my animation here, and I can make my offset even bigger. And so now, when I scroll, you should really be able to see, okay, I'm scrolling, it's offset, it's not animating yet, it's not animating, now it animates, okay, because I gave it more of an offset, okay? And so that's really, really cool. Okay, now I want to animate div block 2, but a little bit differently. So I'm going to grab my div here, I'm going to come to element trigger, and again, scroll into view, and I'm going to give it an action, and this time I want this one to, I don't know, jiggle. So we're going to have this one jiggle, and we're going to give it an offset again of, I don't know, 20%. All right, and then when I come to preview this, we can see that both of our divs are getting animated differently. All right, so there's a lot here we can do with Webflow animations. This is super, super basic, but you can see here that the Webflow functionality over here with our interactions menu, it makes it so easy to animate the elements on your page that other website builders don't have built in. Okay, so Webflow, I think, is the best website builder you can use for animating your site. Okay. All right, so the last thing we're going to talk about here is Exhibit 7, and that's going to be optimizing for mobile. All right, and so, you know, it's great that we can do all these really cool things in Webflow. We can add animations and style divs and nest divs and do all this cool stuff like Flexbox. But if it only looks good on desktop and people on their phones or on mobile or iPads go to your website and it looks like trash, what's the point? And so Webflow makes it super easy to optimize your website across different breakpoints, they call it, or sizes of viewports, okay? And so I'll show you how we do this. So right now up here, you can see that we are kind of on the desktop base breakpoint, okay? So we're gonna build our website on the desktop view, and then we're gonna optimize it for mobile when we're done. All right, so this all looks good on desktop, but what if I come to mobile? How does my website look on mobile? And you can see it doesn't look good, okay? It just looks horrible. And so the way we are going to optimize our site across these different breakpoints is essentially with this tiered structure up here. And so the way this logic works is any style, position, or class that I give direction to in my desktop base breakpoint is going to flow down to each breakpoint below it, unless I override it by changing something in the breakpoint below it. So, for example, if I have this stacked left to right on my desktop view, but on my tablet view, I change my Flexbox from left to right to up and down. Well, then we can see that if I go down to mobile, it's going to be stacked up and down. But if I come up to desktop, it's still going to be left and right. So that CSS flows down almost the breakpoints. So keep that in mind. And so if I come to mobile here, we can just optimize for this right now. But essentially, we can just fix this. We can make this look better. So I'm going to come to section. I'm just going to change the height of my section. So I'm going to just set it to auto. And so that helped a lot. I have a lot of space here in between my edges. And so I'm just going to remove a lot of the margin here just to make everything a little bit bigger. All right. I'm going to add a little bit more margin here to drop this down a little bit. That looks a little better. And so you can start to see that we are optimizing for mobile. So that is how you can optimize your Webflow site across different breakpoints inside of Webflow. Very, very powerful. All right, guys, that's it. You just learned Webflow as fast as I could possibly teach it. I hope you at least have the basics of Webflow. There's obviously a lot more to explore and get into if you really want to become an expert in building Webflow sites. If you're interested in becoming an expert building Webflow sites, I have a ton of videos that I have linked up here, an entire playlist worth of tutorials that you could use to get your feet under you inside of Webflow. I think, like I said in the beginning, this is the best tool you could use on the market to build websites. You just have to get over the little learning curve at the beginning. So if you guys like this video, get down and smash that like button for me. I'd really appreciate it. If you want to see more videos like this in the future, consider subscribing. That would be awesome. If you have any questions, get down in the comments and let me know. I'd really appreciate it. And I'll see you all in the next video. Peace.